So this is actually a presentation that was adapted from a pruning class that Heather did last year. It was wonderful. And why fix something if it isn't broken, right? So this is all based off of the Planning Your Pruning we did last spring. All of the information is pretty recent. And, if you have questions, we certainly have the answers by this point, so feel free to ask. So the goal for this presentation, my points that I hope you are able to explain at the end of the day are as follows. We want to make sure you understand why trees and shrubs need to be pruned, when they should be pruned, and then how plants respond to three major types of pruning cuts. There are plenty of ways you can prune a tree or shrub, both correct and incorrect, but we'll talk about three specific types that are really important when you are going through and caring for your landscape plants. Now, a lot of people approach pruning with a fair bit of hesitation. It can make people a little bit antsy because often they think that if they cut off a branch of a tree, they're going to kill the tree. And it can be a bit difficult because it's kind of, part of it is science. There are reasons we prune, and there are reasons the plant responds the way it does. And then there's a part of it that's art. So some people who aren't really able to visualize what they want to see in a plant might get a little nervous because they're worried that they might completely mess up the plant and there's no hope for it if they cut too much. So today we're going to look at both of these aspects, and we're going to kind of merge them together to give you a better idea of how to prune in a way that doesn't, make you anxious. So let's talk about the why and the science before we talk about the art and form. We prune plants for a couple of reasons. More often than not, it is to maintain a certain size and shape because there's a plant that we have put on our property that grows too big, or we inherited this plant and we want to make sure that it stays in the space it was confined to at the beginning. But pruning can also stimulate the plant. It will grow or enhance the fruiting or flowering. And sometimes, sometimes it's important to prune so that you can create a balance. Some plants, if you're transplanting them, you're chopping off the roots and confining the roots. And you don't have this vast network anymore. So sometimes you need to prune so that the leaves match the root system. The crown of the plant won't overtax a limited root system. So creating this balance is often really important when you're putting a new plant into the landscape. Now, as we go on, we're going to go into the science of the growth of plants. And this gets a little bit technical, so you might have to hang on with me a little bit. I made one of my coworkers bring me a stem here for some visual aid, and I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute because some people haven't had the benefit of this crash course. So when you look at a stem, this was a branch, and every offshoot has a bud, and there are even buds on the stem, right? And these buds are potential for growth, but all of them are actually controlled by what's called the terminal bud here on the end. And it is really interesting because this terminal bud will actually manage everything below it on the branch. So if per se, the competition, if a branch is in shade, it doesn't want competition from other bushier stems coming off right at the tip of the tree. So this bud will create a hormone called auxin, and auxin will move down the branch and prohibit extra growth. Now, the important thing to remember is that if you get rid of this terminal bud, it kind of creates chaos in the rest of the branch. And the whole idea behind pruning is that you are using this pruning cut to determine where new growth will happen below it. So that's the general idea. And it's a little bit technical, but it can be very important to understand. So let's go ahead and go back to our PowerPoint here. As you can tell, that apical bud at the tip of the branch is really important, and as long as it's in place, it will grow tall, right? The plant will continue to stretch up. So if you get rid of that terminal apical bud at the top of the tree, you'll start seeing a bunch of outward growth. So one place where this is really important is in fruit tree orchards. You don't want your tree to get very, very tall to the point where you are unable to reach the fruit it's producing. So orchard managers will take advantage of getting rid and of the terminal buds and directing growth outward. So a lot of plants, any plant will grow. There's a predetermined size based on the variety you select, and it's not going to confine itself to a space just because you hoped it would. So pruning to maintain size, again, is common because often plants aren't put in the right place, but you can't really expect that pruning a tree to fit a size will be a long-term solution. You usually have to go back over and over again to maintain a certain size, and that can be a lot of work. So keep that in mind if you have the opportunity to plant your own shrubs or trees in your landscape. Research the mature size of the tree or shrub you're interested in and make sure it'll fit the space. And that way you'll have a lower maintenance landscape overall. It's much easier on you as the landscape manager. Now, there is a lot of good that can come from pruning a plant in regards to a plant's health, right? So pruning is often a really critical component of controlling disease in a shrub or tree. It will open the canopy of the plant up so air is able to circulate throughout the plant. And that air circulation is important because it reduces the chance of fungal disease. It also is important because if you already have a disease occurring in a plant, you can prune the disease out. And this is important for controlling diseases like fire blight or azalea leaf gall. Another important aspect of pruning for a plant's health is managing the plant to avoid future damage or to mitigate damage that happens in a storm. So if a branch falls or breaks or snaps, you should be able to prune that branch back to an appropriate point to make sure that disease doesn't enter the plant. You can also kind of declutter the center of the plant. And again, that's good for air circulation. Or if there are branches that are crossing over, it's important to remove one of those two branches. If you allow them to remain, they will sit and rub against each other, and that creates a wound in the wood. And that wound, again, is another point where pests or disease can enter the rest of the tree. Now, a lot of the questions we get about pruning revolves around timing, and it's not as difficult as people perceive it to be. There are some good rules of thumb you can keep in mind, and it will really help you kind of determine whether or not it's the appropriate time to take a pair of pruning shears out into the front yard. So first, you never ever want to prune any plant in fall. The only exception to this is if you are maybe mitigating some damage that happened at some point and you absolutely have to take care of it. The reason you want to avoid pruning in fall is because that auxin at the tip of the branch is inhibiting everything below it. And once you get rid of the terminal bud on a branch, you're going to see bushy growth start happening. And all of the little branches that come off from that point, they're susceptible to freeze damage whenever temperatures drop. And that really takes a toll on pretty much every ornamental plant. So you really want to avoid pruning in fall. The second timing rule is a pretty simple one. Know what plant you have. Sometimes this can take a little bit of research if you inherited a landscape instead of planting it all yourself. We can help you with that if you need it. But knowing what plant you have gives you a whole lot of insight, not only about pruning, it can tell you what types of pests you might see on that plant later on. But it tells you when the plant is flowering, when it produces fruit. And that information is really important because you don't want to cut away parts of the plant that might fruit right before it fruits or flowers. So that is the major thing when you're considering when to prune a plant, is when does the plant flower and on what type of wood does the plant flower? The first type of plant is the type that flowers on new growth. This new growth is often called like primicanes or, new wood. This is something that emerges from a bud off the stem in spring, and then it grows a certain amount and then puts out a flower. Now, these types of plants you want to prune in late winter or like the cusp of spring, because pruning encourages new growth. And since these plants flower on new growth, you'll get a much bigger display out of that plant. Examples of this plant are on the screen, things like beautyberry and sweet shrub and things like that. Crepe myrtles are also a really good example. And they will put out, just an abundance of new shoots, and you'll get a very beautiful display. The second type of plant is the type that will flower on old wood. So they will set their buds way back in fall, or maybe even right after they finish blooming in summer or the season before. So late winter pruning or that springtime pruning will completely remove any flower buds that the plant has already set. So you end up getting a really, really sad display instead of a prolific one. So the plants in this list are ones that you usually see blooming in spring, and you want to wait until the blossoms have faded. Keep in mind that hydrangeas are kind of split into two groups. There are hydrangeas that will bloom on new growth, and there are hydrangeas like big leaf hydrangeas that will bloom on old growth. So know what type you have and research it before you take pruning shears to the plant. And yeah, the floricane is the previous year's growth. You'll sometimes hear these plants referred to as that, or this part of the plant. So we're going to talk a little bit about the tools you'll need. Things like hedge trimmers, loppers, and bypass pruners are really good tools to have on hand. For larger plants, you're probably looking at a hand saw or something similar. Something to note about the pruning shears or loppers is you want the bypass structure, the ones where the two blades will cross each other. And you really want to avoid the anvil type pruners, the ones that have one blade and a platform. The reason for this is with that anvil type, the wood that you are cutting will likely be split or crushed or damaged. And instead of having a nice clean cut that will heal over, you're creating a whole new problem where disease might enter the plant. So be very careful to avoid those, and always use bypass if possible. Make sure that you have proper protective gear when you're going out. Gloves and eye protection are very important. You don't want to hurt yourself while you're pruning. We are working with sharp objects here. And another really good thing to keep in mind is that chainsaws aren't really a good piece of pruning equipment. They're great for tree removal, but if you have a large tree, it's kind of unwieldy to use a chainsaw to take a branch off. So definitely, if possible, go for the hand saw, or even better, if it's a really big project, call a professional. They'll have the equipment, the protective gear, and kind of the know-how to execute that safely. So as a general rule, as you're going to your bush to prune it for the first time, you don't want to prune more than about a fourth or maybe a third of that plant away, because that can stress the plant out. You also want to keep in mind that painting over the pruning cuts is no longer recommended. There was a lot of research done on it, and there was no benefit found to putting anything on top of that cut. So leave it open, let the wound oxidize against air. It's really good for the plant to be able to do that. And keep in mind that having that clean cut is very, very important. So we're going to talk also a little bit about the types of pruning cuts, and there are actually quite a few. Remember, we have the three that we'll talk about in depth. One of which is shearing. Shearing, I always think of what people do to sheep, right? And it's very similar. So shearing, because of how common it is, we'll discuss it at length. We're going to talk about heading. Sometimes heading is a good thing to use for a plant. Sometimes it's not. It kind of depends on your goals and how well you're thinking through the situation. Thinning is usually the best way to keep a natural form and keep the plant open and airy. It's weird to say this, but it's my favorite pruning technique. I don't know, that's probably a little strange. There's also rejuvenation pruning, and this is a sort of situation where you have a plant that is in dire straits, or there's something that just went terribly wrong about the form of the plant. Some plants respond well to this, others don't. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Basal pruning is also an option. It's not mentioned as much or used as much, so we're not going to talk too much about that. And then there's branch removal, which is exactly what it sounds like. So diving into these a little closer, shearing. Shearing is very, very common. You see it used to make these topiary forms that are really formal and uniform. It creates flat sides and tops. It's what you use to make, a shrub look like a horse or something. And it can have a striking appearance in your landscape, but what usually happens is that you are cutting the tips of those branches away with some sort of hedge trimmer, right? And as you do this over time, you end up with a really heavy shell of leaves around the outside of the plant. And if air circulation is important to prevent disease, creating a shell of leaves is really bad for the air circulation, right? So it's kind of important to be aware of that risk if you decide to use shearing on any of your shrubs. Now, another thing to keep in mind is if you have vertical sides to a bush, what's happening is you are shading the lower leaves on that plant. And again, over time, shading those leaves will mean that it becomes thin, or perhaps those leaves end up falling off the plant because they're not needed by the plant anymore. And you can start getting a really unwieldy appearance, right? So if you want long-term success with some of these formal borders, a lot of the times, instead of having vertical sides, people will have slightly sloped sides so that those lower branches are able to receive sunlight. Heading cuts. So these can be used to reduce the height of a plant, but it does really encourage bushiness. So it's something you have to be careful about. Using pruners, you select a point right above a node and you remove that top terminal bud. This will let those lateral buds break dormancy and grow. And so it can be used to the advantage of a person, kind of like that example of fruiting trees where you don't want the tree to be very, very tall. And when it talks about a node, I'll go ahead and stop sharing again just so you guys can see this. So a node on a plant is kind of like the intersection on a stem. So you have the tip and you go down and you see that there are some buds here. And at that junction, that is what's called a node. Then you have the space where there's nothing happening and then another node. And then you have this long space with nothing happening and then buds again. So wherever you see a bud on a stem, that's a node. You can also extend that principle to where there are branches coming off the center, right? So moving down the internode space where there's nothing going on and then you have branches, again, that is a node. So when you're making a heading cut, you want to make sure that you are taking a cut right above one of these lateral nodes, right? And that will allow those the lateral buds on the plant to break dormancy. All right, let me share screen. Sorry guys, if I'm making you seasick going in and out of the PowerPoint. Moving along though, next we have thinning. And again, it's a weird thing to say, but it's my favorite. So the whole idea behind thinning is that you're not trying to change the natural form of the plant. You're just kind of decluttering it. You're getting rid of any dead branches that are inside of the plant. You're removing anything that's crossing over. And you choose the branch you want to remove and you trace it down to the point on the stem where it shoots off from. And then you trim that. Now, these thinning cuts will relieve crowding and allow airflow to go through and sunlight, which is really beneficial as well. And you know, if you have fruiting plants like blueberries can really benefit from this because they can get really, really bushy. Next up, we have rejuvenation. I always think of the monster American holly my grandmother had. We had to do something with it. It had gotten out of control. And it did just fine with being cut back to the ground, and it sprung back up. So the idea behind this is to give these plants a new start. So you kind of select spaces about 8 to 12 inches off the ground, and that's where you cut these plants back to. Again, don't leave a stump when you cut this. Make sure you're cutting right above one of the nodes. Now, most evergreens, so things like, I think of things like juniper, right? Evergreens tend to not recover well from this. And in the case of juniper, the buds on the old wood end up dying over time. So if you cut past those green needles, you're actually cutting into a part of the wood that will never sprout anything new. So make sure that you're familiar with the type of plant you're pruning back. Loropetalums do well with this. And make sure that they will be able to recover from this. Another good one is like butterfly bush. They will respond well. Basal pruning. So this is kind of like one of the methods you can use for blueberry bushes. So after 3 years of growth, or with blackberries after a single year, those stems have produced fruit and they are no longer productive to the plant. So you want to remove those branches down to the closest juncture if it is up toward the top of the plant, or oftentimes these are coming out from the ground. So you want to prune them back to the ground. This allows more canes to grow and it will increase your yield over time. So just kind of be aware of what is new growth on your plant and what is old growth on your plant. And it'll help you kind of manage that plant very well. Branch removal. So this is for large trees. Oftentimes, people need to kind of open up a canopy or get a branch away from a roof of a house, or maybe they want more sunlight on their yard. So we need to be careful when we're approaching branch removal. It can, if it is done improperly, it leaves these big stumps that are kind of ugly. They will end up rotting, and that is detrimental to the health of the tree. So you want to make sure that you are being careful with the placement of your cut. And there is a method, it's called the 3-cut method. And this 3-cut method is utilized to make sure that you don't damage the tree as you are cutting it. And again, if it's a project that means you have to leave the ground and climb up in a ladder, please hire a professional. We don't want anyone getting hurt because they're trying to do this themselves. So here are 2 examples. The first example is a method called drop crotching, and the second one is this 3-cut method. And let's just do this because drop crotch is usually, there are very rare cases where it is necessary, and it almost always causes terrible, terrible problems for the tree. If you look on the diagram, and I'll see if I can point at it with a laser pointer. Can you see that? Yeah. Okay. So your first cut is actually just a tiny little notch, a couple of inches away from the joint, right? And this notch ensures that when you take the rest of the branch off, the bark doesn't get stripped down when the branch starts to fall. It's like an insurance cut. After you make that first notch, then you take off the rest of the branch, and that kind of relieves the weight off of the rest of the nub that's left behind. But you don't want to stop there. The third cut is kind of your cleaning cut. You can take your time and full attention to this cut to make sure that it is being done well. And that third cut goes right here, outside of what's called the collar of the tree. Now, this collar is really important to the recovery, right? So it is full of these cells that are able to grow and cover over the nub or the open wound that's in the side of the tree. If you damage that collar, you end up having either uneven growth going over the wound, or you might not have the wound cover over at all. And that's a problem when you are thinking of the tree kind of isolating the damage and avoiding any type of infection. So again, make sure if you see kind of like, I think they kind of refer to it as like a spare tire type of growth or a donut growth, where the color moves over the wound and you kind of get this circle in the middle. If it looks, kind of like a thin slit, that means that, you probably damaged parts of the color when you were removing the branch. And again, you don't need to paint the branch with anything. You don't need to paint the stump at all. It can, in the best of case, it does nothing. In the worst of cases, it inhibits growth and trap in kind of moisture and decay. So make sure that you approach this carefully. Plan for your pruning. Kind of go and actually look at the plant before you start cutting branches off. For our deciduous plants, it's easier to do this when the leaves are gone. And it lets you see kind of the inside structure of the plant. Look for the problems like dead branches or broken pieces or crossing branches. So anything like that is probably something that needs to go. Also look for wounds that happened at some point, open sores somewhere. They should be, the branches that have these issues need to be removed as like a thinning cut. And if you're dealing with a tree, that's, you know, early spring is a good time for that. And hopefully, if it's a tree, that's the only thing you need to do that year. And maybe you want to revisit it the next year for your small branches that come out. But, you know, hopefully that's all you need to worry about. You also want to consider the balance of the tree when you're looking at it. Remember that, like, you don't want to unbalance a plant. You want it to be growing evenly. Because structurally speaking, if you're removing a lot from one side of the plant, it's gonna put stress on other junctures and joints in the wood. So symmetry is very important. Keep in mind that you are only going to be removing maximum 1/3 of the plant's green matter at a time, right? So do not get overly worried. You can always come back and prune more if you need to. You cannot put branches back on the tree or shrub. So work slowly and try and visualize it as you go. Now, when you're considering structure, there's kind of this concept that you want to make sure that the branches are about at 45 degrees to 60 degrees. And that's a really strong angle for the plant. So anything that is at a different angle is going to be weaker, and there's a possibility of failure with that branch. And water sprouts, you want to get rid of water sprouts. They're the branches that kind of shoot straight up off of a lateral branch. They're not structurally sound. They're not good for the plant at all. Again, different plants have different natural forms. They have different sizes and tendencies. So make sure that when you're planning on pruning it, make sure you know what plant you have and what its natural form is. If you're trying to make a plant, you know, that usually spreads really wide, go vertical, I mean, you're going to be really fighting against that plant. And the more you fight it, the more stressed that plant will become, and the higher likelihood you have of losing the plant entirely. So knowing what form the plant wants to take is valuable, because then you can work with it to create, you know, a healthy and beautiful structure. There are some really good examples out there of fighting natural form versus, you know, nurturing it and letting it do what it does best. So the tree on the left has been cut at the same spot over and over and over again, and that's called pollarding. And it reminds me of the Whomping Willow in the Harry Potter movies, right? It's really knobby, and my personal opinion is that it is not pretty at all. Some people might disagree. And it really creates terrible imbalanced structure. A whole lot of shoots will start spreading out from those spots, and it quickly becomes a problem because if you're pollarding it over and over again, you're going to have to cut more and more shoots the longer it goes on. So, you know, kind of working with nature would be more beneficial for the health of the tree and for your schedule and the time you put into the plant. The lovely crepe myrtle here on the right of the screen has been allowed to grow in its natural spreading form. And, you know, thinning it and making sure that it's healthy has been really beneficial, because you see this really graceful beautiful appearance. So make sure that you're kind of working with the plant instead of against it. The classic example, I can't believe I didn't mention this. The classic example of what not to do is called crepe murder. I'm sure some of you have heard of that before. It's really common. You'll watch people go out with their equipment and just completely hack crepe myrtles off, at 6 feet from the ground or something. And it just creates this really terrible bushy growth. It looks awful. You get a lot of flowers from it, but the second the flowers are gone, they don't have these branching bushy forms. So even in summer, you can see that the plant, was very severely chopped. And there's very little you can do to come back from that. It is very important to know the plant you're selecting for your landscape. It's important for a number of reasons. First of all, the environmental conditions have to match up. You want to make sure you're giving it enough light. But another thing to consider is that you can take a shrub and make it look more like a tree, and it will be happy in that environment. It doesn't bother the shrub too much, and it will create a lovely form. If you've got a limited space, this is a really good option. Even our small trees are fairly tall, so you don't want to be fighting a tree in a 10 by 20 sized backyard or something. So keep that in mind. So now that we've talked about the science of why plants respond the way they do, why we prune, and kind of the ways we can prune, let's kind of go into the style of it all, the art behind it. Make sure you know what you want before you go out and prune things. That way you're not damaging something and in such a way that you're not able to come back from it. So informal landscapes that have naturally growing plants that look, very similar to a healthy plant in its native environment is definitely an option. And honestly, I feel like it's getting a little bit more popular in more recent years, but I could be wrong on that. Maybe that's just my own style. Another option is the very formal garden, symmetry and straight lines. It is very striking to have plants in an unnatural shape. Nature does not occur in a straight line. So to have bushes that create edges is really visually striking. But keep in mind that the plant does not want to be a box. The plant doesn't want to be a perfect sphere. It wants to stretch out and get as much sunlight as possible. So the formal garden is going to take a lot more work. You're going to have to very consistently go out there and trim off the young new growth that's getting unruly. So make sure you plan for that if you decide that you want a formal garden. Maybe have someone willing to help you, or maybe employ someone to help you. Now, you want to take your style, and again, you want to kind of merge it with the form of the plant. You want to think about kind of the balance between all the different components. You want, you don't want a house competing with a large tree right next to it. Not only is it not good for the tree, or possibly not good for the house, but it's visually, it kind of attacks you a little bit. So kind of figure out good spacing, and if there are plants around that could potentially compete visually, make sure to create placements. Small plants can do well in clusters, but trees often don't look as good clumped up in a garden. If you have a fence, kind of consider what spacing you need so that the fence isn't being encroached on, and, visually speaking, your eye isn't being led to a straight stop. when it meets that fence. So, kind of merge it all together. Take some time to think about it. And that time is really important. So make sure that you're not rushing it. If you can employ your mind's eye to visualize it ahead of time, it will be really beneficial because, you're not going to be making a cut that you might regret later. Take a cut, step back, look at the plant, maybe shift your perspective a little bit. See if you need to cut something else a little later on, and just kind of go through a slow process. Again, you can always cut more of a plant. You cannot add branches back. So as we're nearing the end, I've got a couple more slides here, and these are kind of your general rules that you want to pay attention to. You really need clean, sharp tools. If you don't clean your shears, you could be spreading disease, especially if you are pruning the plant for the purpose of removing a diseased branch. So make sure that you use some sort of sanitation, like a 10% bleach solution on your tools before you move from one plant to another. Please make sure that you are protecting yourself. While pruning, you are by nature using sharp and kind of dangerous tools. So take your precautions and don't tell me that you cut your thumb off. Please be very careful. Start with the problem branches. Look for the things that are unhealthy, that are crossing, that have wounds on them, or that are broken. Those definitely need to go for the health of the plant. And then only cut about 1/4 to 1/3 of the green growth at a time. Otherwise, you risk the health of the plant. When you are pruning, completely dispose of the leaves and the branches. This is, again, very important for pruning disease out of a plant. You don't want that disease to come back and re-attack the tree or the bush because you decided, oh, I'll just compost the dead plant material and spread it back out on my garden. You don't want that. So if you've got diseased leaves and branches, you need to bag them up and get them off your property. If you are pruning with a certain aesthetic in mind, be aware of what the plant's natural form is and how that compares to what you want it to look like, and then cut a little bit, stand back, adjust your position, cut a little bit more, adjust it. Treat it as a slow process and just don't rush it. Junipers and cypresses, things that have green needles, do not prune them beyond that green portion of the branch. If you do, it's not going to grow back. I wish I could tell my apartment complex this. They're redoing some of the siding on the property, and they just, they cut essentially a pathway in one of the junipers. And I was just sitting here like, well, it's never going to grow back ever again. So be very careful with evergreen needled plants. Do not leave stumps. This image really, really shocked me. I saw it, like, it's just a whole mess right at that node that almost, it looks like the beginning of some really terrible pollarding. So do not leave the stump of the branch. Make sure you go all the way to either the branch collar or a node on the branch. And clean up healthy clippings to compost it. There's no issue with that as long as there is not a disease on the plant. We have plenty of time for questions, about 15 minutes, I think, and it looks like